Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss In Defense of Sanity, the best essays of G.K. Chesterton. And this week, we move into the longest of the essays and the one about which I'm least competent to make any remark, Mary, Queen of Scots. And we're going to turn this over to you, Joseph, to wax eloquently.
Well, I'll wax anyway, but Vivian, if you want to join in, please feel free. Perhaps you can leap in, interject if you've got something before the pages I reference here. So the bottom of page 281, this is not about Mary, Queen of Scots, it's about history in a general sense. He talks about the religious interpretation of history. There is no other interpretation of history. So I think, one thing I think that we need to sort of have clear is that there's like three aspects of history. There's historical chronology, which is when things happen, historical, if you might call, mechanics, which is how they happen. But of course, why they happen is to do with the philosophical and religious beliefs, the motives, the religious historical motive. And that's going to be basically based upon how people see the world. If they are completely materialistic, greedy, self-centered, they're going to respond and act accordingly. And on the other hand, if they're religious, they'll act accordingly. So I think he's right there to basically say that if you want to understand history, you have to understand the ideas that animate and motivate history. So I wanted to say that first. I don't know if that's going to prompt anybody to comment.
But why should we care about Mary, Queen of Scots?
We should care about Mary, Queen of Scots, first of all, because if we don't understand the past, we don't understand the present. And specifically, we'll actually get to Mary, Queen of Scots in a moment, the way that she was manipulated and ultimately destroyed by Machiavellian self-interest. And that's certainly a lesson which is applicable to all ages in human history. So she's an example that we're invited to learn from.
All right, but there's thousands and thousands of historical examples. Why this one?
Well, I don't actually. It's a good question. He's actually, this is part of a series on, what's the series on here? He mentions this is a talk on
revaluations
of what? Certain characters.
Not sure, but I mean,
the key thing about Mary Queen of Scots, from a Catholic perspective, Mary Queen of Scots, according to a saint such as Saint Pius V, was the legitimate monarch of England and Scotland. Elizabeth I, as the illegitimate child of an illegitimate marriage, Henry VIII having married Anne Boleyn when he was still legally married in the eyes of the Church to Catherine of Aragon, that meant, of course, that Elizabeth was illegitimate and therefore could not be the Queen of England. So the reason that Mary Queen of Scots is relevant is the fact that we have an example here of the true monarch, the legitimate monarch, in the eyes of the Church and ultimately in the eyes of God, being usurped for Machiavellian reasons by an illegitimate ruler. And amongst other things, as regards art, a large part of Shakespeare's oeuvre in the Elizabethan period, in other words, when the illegitimate monarch is on the throne, is about usurping monarchs. And Mary, Queen of Scots, is the person who's being usurped.
All right.
I think she's important, Father, because she did capture the imagination in arts and letters in multiple ways. And if you were to rely on these works of imagination, whether poetry or paintings or films or movies, if you were to rely on those to tell the story, you would come away with a very warped perspective. And I think this little essay by Chesterton is just a marvelous piece of reevaluation to put out there. Even though he says he's not a historian, I think he does a wonderful job of uncovering the motives of the different players. As you've just said, Joseph, the real important thing, as what Chesterton said, is why people do what they do. And I think Chesterton has done more than most things I've either read or seen in uncovering what these characters are, why they're doing what they're doing, which goes a long way in now helping to interpret these artistic representations, which are, I think, off point or off key or something.
One of the most important motivations for Hilaire Belloc's life and work was correcting what he called tomfool Protestant history. We've all heard the phrase that history is written by the victors. Well, it was the Whigs that wrote the history of England. And so they demonized and villainized Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, no one's going to say, or very few people at least will say that she was a saint. But the point is that we get a very skewed version of her if we believe the Whig historians. So this is healthy historical revisionism on the part of Chesterton, as it is also on the part of Belloc and more recently Antonia Fraser, to see Mary Queen of Scots in a more objective light. And if I can look at page 296, the last paragraph there, he sums it up here very succinctly. The people who really killed Mary Stuart were the new millionaires, as we should say nowadays, the people who had received the church lands at the Reformation, the Cecils, the Russells, and all the gang who were horribly afraid that if a Catholic sovereign came to the throne, it was just possible that they might have to disgorge some of the money. He does, I think, let Elizabeth off too lightly. He sort of blames the new millionaires, the Cecils and the Russells, etc., and saying Elizabeth was ill and she didn't really know what was going on. I don't think that's true. She certainly signed the order for Mary Queen of Scots to be executed. They wouldn't have done it without her. So I think he lets her off too lightly. But that's basically the key thing there is that. And then the next paragraph. Now, if Elizabeth had died before Mary, and the fact that he says she was ill, by every recognised principle of the age, by every dogma of royal inheritance, it was absolutely inevitable that Mary Stuart should become Queen of England. That was what Cecil and the Lords were afraid of. They were quite simply afraid of Elizabeth dying and Mary surviving. And there we have, I think, in a nutshell, why they contrived her execution on largely pumped-up grounds.
So,
yes, and I think that just cuts through a lot of the romanticized baloney, whether it's romanticization of Mary Queen of Scots or romanticization of Elizabeth and the Elizabethan regime. I think Chesterton just has a way of just cutting to the quick of the thing.
And I love the fact that on the final page of the essay, or almost the final page of the essay, page 299, he refers to the fact that Elizabeth was basically at heart still a Catholic, and the fact she refused to receive the Anglican ministers when she was dying, saying, "I know you are only hedge priests," in other words, bogus, fake priests. So that's why he says here Elizabeth is a more tragic figure than Mary Queen of Scots, because she dies really pathetically, knowing that she's backed the wrong horse as regards religion, even though she's followed, if you like, her own ego throughout her life.
Well, I cut her a little more slack than that. She's put in a very difficult situation. The only way she can hold on to her throne is by going along with the new millionaires, as they're called, and the Reformation. And anyway, I think she deserves some understanding for the complex situation she was put in. That does not in any way excuse the morality of the actions she takes. It's just, but I think the other thing, the reason why is Mary Queen of Scots important? Well, this whole drama between these two women, these two very powerful, highly educated, cultured women, of the time, I think they do deserve study, and the whole drama of the thing is incredible. As Joseph said, looking into these human dramas of history, as Shakespeare does with his plays, right? This is the human story at large, and it is worth learning about it and studying and thinking about it, and writing poems about it too.
Well, my questions were partly rhetorical because obviously the destruction of the Catholic Church in England and the treatment of Catholics for centuries, is an enormously important historical reality. And it's good to set the record straight here, as Chesterton does. And one lesson here is that it may take 400 years for fake news to be, shown to be what it is. But it's worth doing. It's worth revising history in the sense that the more you know about the facts, the better it is to understand what actually took place. On page 283, is it 283? Oh, yeah. Very in the middle of the page, he kind of sums it up. He says, end of that paragraph, the whole history of that time turns upon the fact that Mary Stuart was living and Elizabeth Tudor was dying. As you said, Joseph, if she died, then all these gains by the millionaires would be probably reversed. So there's another historical lesson. Follow the money.
Yep. And also, Elizabeth had no offspring. Isn't it Mary Stuart's son, who then, even though he's a Protestant king, it's Mary Stuart's son who succeeds Elizabeth. Am I using the right word?
Yes.
Who follows? Yeah. So there's all these interesting ironies to history that no one could have made up. Now, it's too bad that James was still Protestant and that the Catholic Church was still being suppressed and all of that. But still, there are these interesting twists to the tale.
It's true that Henry VIII went to extraordinary lengths to get an heir. The Tudor dynasty, in spite of all of his efforts, dies out with his offspring. There's no grandchildren. And I think there is some element of divine retribution there.
Good. Any more that we need to say about this essay on Mary, Queen of Scots?
Well, I would like to add one little thing about what he says about Thackeray and his Becky Sharp. Becky Sharp, of course, being the anti-heroine of Vanity Fair. But that he sees that Thackeray, this kind of projection that people do, this is a lesson to be taken from this. Not only follow the money, but how people tend to project onto characters and even historical persons what they want to see there. And the fact that he sort of calls out Thackeray for doing this by seeing Mary Stuart as just another Becky Sharp is also like a warning to the wise, right?
Well, as you've actually mentioned that, I will make one other comment on top of that then, because it relates to it. Because on the top of page 284, Chesterton says, the quality which the Victorians did possess was an astonishing power of romantic creation. And secondly, the power of believing in their own romantic creation, so that when they had made a romantic creation, they called it realistic. They thought it was true. And of course, that's the consequence of romanticism, which is all about subjectivism, and it's where it's playing itself out now, of course, it's the radical subjectivism of the gender ideology. But basically, it's all about feeling and emotion. You can make reality what you feel it should be. And that was a Victorian trait, says Chesterton.
As you say, we're finding out it's a human trait that we're seeing now, and you give a perfect example of that. People start believing what they've imagined.
And here's another little bit of irony here on page 293. He says, I think that Swinburne, who wrote the poem that he uses both at the beginning and the ending of this essay, and Thackeray were both modern and therefore romantic and sentimental.
Yes.
To link modernity with romanticism and sentimentality, I think seems paradoxical to a lot of people. Maybe Joseph would like to explain how that works.
Well, I mean, I think you've largely done it. But the key thing is that Romanticism was a reaction against rationalism. Rationalism was all about empiricism. And Romanticism's reaction against that sort of scientism of empiricism was in many instances an overreaction, as is often the case. And so you privilege feeling over reason and you end up with nonsense. And that's basically how Romanticism has played itself out into deconstruction and nihilism and postmodernism and all the rest of the stuff that's followed on from it.
Well, the most important ism, though, is realism. And that was something which is characteristic of the Middle Ages, especially the High Middle Ages, and precisely rationalism undermined that. And then the reaction to that was romanticism. Let's put those together. You know, let's be romantic but rational. That's what marriage is. So the husband is the romantic part of the pair, and the wife is the rational part. It's important for marriages, right? Who keeps the books?
Depends on whether or not you're married to an accountant.
I'm not going to get involved with that particular metaphor.
Yeah.
Being too much of a coward.
I keep these books at the house.
Right.
I don't keep the other books.
Well, let's move on to this next chapter, which also has an important literary feature to it because it's about George MacDonald. And knowing how important George MacDonald was for C.S. Lewis, I was surprised to see how much G.K. Chesterton says he owes to George MacDonald. So this Calvinist Scottish minister, quite unusually, I mean, is a man who's doing fairy tales, and look at the influence George MacDonald has had on the world through C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah, I saw an analogy here, actually, to the very famous episode that C.S. Lewis tells in his book Surprised by Joy, of coming across a copy of George MacDonald's Phantastes at a railway station. Can't remember which railway station it is now. And how that changed his life. I think he said it baptized his imagination.
Yes.
I mean, you have an exact parallel here. I, for one, this first paragraph, I, for one, can really testify to a book that has made a difference to my whole existence. Although at the bottom of the paragraph, it's not the same book by MacDonald, it's The Princess and the Goblin. But in both instances, one book by George MacDonald had a life-changing ramifications to these two writers.
And The Princess and the Goblin, I must say, had a huge impact on me as well. When I first read it, I only read George MacDonald because of knowing his influence on C.S. Lewis and thinking, well, who's George MacDonald then? And what is, and I read The Princess and the Goblin out loud to my children. Oh my goodness, this story, it's the whole atmosphere of the story as well as the plot of the story, in that it takes spiritual realities seriously. And so this line on page 302 by Chesterton, how his story suggests how near both the best and the worst things are to us from the first, even perhaps especially at the first. MacDonald does not in any way sentimentalize childhood. He situates childhood right in the thick of the spiritual battle between good and evil, which is a very interesting thing to do because we tend to want to tell stories of children where they're not in peril, or if they are, they quickly get out, or they're quickly saved or something. MacDonald puts his children in spiritual peril, and they now have to go through some pretty harrowing experiences to get through them. But what he also does, they're not getting through them alone. And the great comfort to his stories, as dark and scary as they kind of are in places and in turns, he always has these figures of grace and providence. In the case of The Princess and the Goblin, the grandmother living up in the tower, who somehow has this protective role, and yet she doesn't prevent the child from having to go through the test and ordeal, but somehow she's there. I found this story very moving, very powerful, and now that I've read this essay, I want to reread it again. He goes on and says, there's something, this is the bottom of 302 and spills over to 303, there is something not only imaginative but intimately true about the idea of the goblins being below the house and capable of besieging it from the cellars. When the evil things besieging us do appear, they do not appear outside, but inside. And this is such insight into the truth that the spiritual battle between good and evil is raging right here in our own heart.
And then I underlined the immediately following sentences, because this is why Chesterton, this is the kind of atmosphere or ambiance or attitude that Chesterton derived from this. Anyhow, that simple image of a house that is our home, that is rightly loved as our home, but of which you hardly know the best or the worst, and must always wait for the one and watch against the other, has always remained in my mind as something singularly solid and unanswerable. So that's a theme that you see so often in Chesterton, coming home, you know. The man who goes out on an adventure and he comes and he discovers this wonderful island and he's so excited about it. Well, he came back to his own home, you know.
Yeah. And I highlighted that same passage, but so he makes the same point on the same page further down, about 8 lines up from the bottom. The fairy tale was the inside of the ordinary story and not the outside. So if we go to escape, we're escaping into ourselves, in some sense, not out of ourselves. And this sort of very much evokes in me Chesterton's wonderful chapter in Orthodoxy, The Ethics of Elfland, which is exactly about the truth to be discovered in fairy stories.
And I love the way that Chesterton describes MacDonald on page 305 as a mystic. And so we think about this, you know, Calvinistic, Scottish, conjures up a whole atmosphere, doesn't it? And then to have this man, this storyteller, be seen by Chesterton as a mystic, I think is a very profound understanding of what a mystic really is.
And I think that various people, including C.S. Lewis, have questioned whether MacDonald can be called a Calvinist. You know, he's a Protestant minister. No, I didn't mean that doctrinally, but like what he came out of. I wasn't accusing you of saying that. Sorry, I'm just really saying that it's quite clear from his stories that free will is essential, and that some sort of idea of predestination in the Calvinistic sense is not part of George MacDonald's psychic makeup. That's quite clear.
Right. I totally agree with you that despite of what he might have been raised in, here's a man who confronted spiritual realities and came to understand them, which just goes to show you that the truth is there for all to see.
I agree, but was he not a Calvinist minister?
He was a Presbyterian, but you know, you have free will Presbyterians.
Was he a minister? I thought he was a minister.
Oh yeah, he was a he was a Presbyterian minister. But again, there are free will Presbyterians and there are hardline Calvinist Presbyterians. So this is an argument they have amongst themselves, and it's quite clear to me that George MacDonald is a great believer in the freedom of the will. Contra.
Yeah. No, that's and even if we do no other good in these book clubs than to point people to George MacDonald, Back in the North Wind, Fantastes, Princess and the Goblin. I mean, really, even if our imaginations are somewhat clean because of, Catholic environment and Catholic reading, there's always a purification that takes place. In fact, I think Lewis, said something in his introduction to his book on the book on Athanasius of St. Anthony or something like that. You know, of every 3 books you read, one should be an old book. And a second thing I find, because I read a lot of manuscripts for Ignatius Press, and it's good to go back to C.S. Lewis and kind of cleanse my imagination and remind myself of what really good writing is like, you know, and Chesterton likewise. And MacDonald serves that same function.
Yeah.
So onward.
I think we might squeeze one more in. It's not a very long one, the next one.
Okay. Tolerating other religions, page 308. Again, he has his little, that's why he's so quotable. He says things so succinctly that have proverbial value. So in that first paragraph, he talks about the Parliament, you know, English Parliament. And he says, one sentence, the club is mightier than a constituency. That is, it's the deep state all over again. You elect these people, and then they go on, and they're not representing you anymore.
You know, Father, it was funny because over the weekend we were with our elder son, and he was making the same complaints that we all are about our current state of affairs and the government and whatever. And I said, oh, I came across a pithy quote from Chesterton that meets that right head on. And I pulled out this book and read that very line to him.
Good.
But you are completely correct that he is so quotable, because there you have him basically showing the fundamental weakness of parliamentary so-called democracy in one sentence, of a very short sentence. And then 2 paragraphs down, a pithy put down of ecumenism, as it's normally practiced. Men did not come there to explain their religion. They came to explain it away. You know, in order to actually to get on with other people, we have to sort of make excuses for what we believe and water it down and dilute it.
I find that the only people who do that are the people making excuses for what they believe are really people who are embarrassed by the doctrine of the church, no longer really believe the doctrine of the church, and why they would be chosen to represent their religion at any meeting is beyond me. Yeah, but I mean, that is what often happens.
It's what C.S. Lewis calls Christianity in water. I mean, why would you want that? And then on 309, I like the fact he makes, he's actually praising this book, right? About that by someone who believes in Zoroastrianism. But he says his book, this is 309, about 8 lines down. His book is really an apologia and not an apology. And again, this important difference. Obviously, Newman's apologia is not an apology in the sense of saying sorry for his faith. It's actually his defense of his faith, an apologia in that other sense of the word, not the modern sense of the word, where we're basically, you know, asking people to forgive us for any beliefs we have which might offend them.
So Chesterton actually, with this essay, sets us the example as to what true interfaith dialogue should look like. He sets aside the people who are not doing it the way they ought to. Then he takes this man's book on his beliefs, the Creed of Zoroaster, and mulls them over and thinks about them and respects him for it and all of that, and then ends the essay by saying, but here's what Christians believe and why. And so it just goes to show you that, of course, we can read other people's religions and engage in those things and still put our own forward as a valid option among many, and believe sincerely that we found the better part.
Yeah, I also think that he touches something quite profound at the beginning of the final paragraph on page 309. When he says, generally, the difficulty is not to tolerate other people's religion. The trouble is to tolerate our own religion, or rather, to speak more strictly, to get our own religion to tolerate us. I do think a lot of the time that people stop liking the doctrines and dogmas of the church is because they don't like to live by the strictures that those doctrines and dogmas impose upon them. So we cease to tolerate the actual orthodoxy of our own beliefs, and therefore we have the desire to water down or equivocate those doctrines, which makes it very easy for us then, of course, to associate with those who believe different doctrines and say that these differences are not important because we wish that they weren't. That's the point. We're trying to wish them away.
But he's also talking about the difficulty of tolerating religious people who've become intolerable, not because they cling to their beliefs, but they don't even understand or want to defend their own beliefs, right? The person we really find exasperating, he who does not understand our beliefs and yet also does not agree with his own. So there is this strange limbo land that people find themselves in, that they remain attached to a religion for some reason or another, even when they no longer believe it or take it seriously.
Or if they're living a lifestyle or found their life complicated and confusing because of decisions they've made, they want the mess they made of things to be tolerated by the church, right? And of course, the church will absolve the sinner, but it's not ever going to say the sin was okay because we've done the sin and somehow we need to feel better about ourselves.
Right.
I like, Vivian, you refer to this in the apologia thing here, or maybe you did, Joseph, how he looks at this book on Zoroastrianism, and he looks at it sympathetically, and then he describes it succinctly in a way that is very enlightening. So we know that Zoroastrianism has this idea of duality. There's a good principle and evil principle, and they're equal. So the structure of the cosmos, the structure of being, is this equality between good and evil, which are in a conflict. And so he summarized that on page 310 at the bottom. The great principle of Zoroastrian philosophy seems to be that the thorn is essential to the rose. That is, you can't have good without an equal evil being associated with it. And then he ends this, I love the ending, page 311. A black and white artist always treats one or the other color as the background. The artist may be scrolling black on white when he's an illustrator in pen and ink. He may be scrolling white on black when he's a schoolboy, chalking the schoolmaster's nose on the blackboard. But the pen and ink artist knows that the page is white previous to the arrival of the pen and ink. The wicked schoolboy knows that the blackboard is black. So we as Christians should always believe that this is a white world with black spots, not a black world with white spots. I should always believe the good in it was its primary plan. Also, I should always remember that chess came from Persia. Of course, chess is what? It's equal white and black spots on a board, right?
Yeah, but can I say something here as a voice of dissent? Not to the theology you've just encapsulated there, but this just confirms to me that I am convinced. I need to dig deeper. That Chesterton did not know how to play chess. for two reasons. First of all, that chess is literally the triumph of logic, reason over its absence, right? So it's absolutely ratio. It's not dualistic. The one who is closer to reason wins. And the other thing about it is that in The Man Who Was Thursday, he says, "Don't you see?" Syme says to Lucian Gregory in The Man Who Was Thursday, "Don't you see? We have checkmated each other. You can't checkmate each other, right? Checkmate is one person checkmates the other person. You can stalemate each other." So, I'm convinced that Chesterton couldn't play chess. And this essay has merely reinforced that suspicion.
Well, but I want to defend Chesterton. He's not, when he refers to chess, he's really talking about not the game, but the board. The chess board is a big square with little squares on it, equal black and white. That's what he's referring to.
Yeah, that metaphor works, and if that's what he's saying, but he seems to be besmirching the game of chess by association by saying that chess came from Persia. He's not talking about the board here, he's talking about the game. And if I can maybe just by way of finishing, just on a lighter note, on assumption we're ready to finish.
Okay.
There is at the end of the paragraph on page 310, I just love this sentence. With the movement of iron self-control, I hear refrain from making a pun about a dualist and a dualist, which of course he hasn't done. He has not shown iron self-control. He's actually indulged himself with the pun, which is, I think, hilarious.
Very good.
Very good.
Great way to end. So, ladies and gentlemen, and that's all there are ladies and gentlemen, nothing in between. We will see you next week on the Forum Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.